the Lifelong Learning and Wellness Program Manager here. Now, we just started to actually promote on some different platforms, including Eventbrite, and so we may have some guests here that are not familiar with ACC, so I wanted to welcome you and give you a little bit of background of what we do. ACC stands for a Community of Caring, and we have all kinds of different services, and that includes memory care, assisted and independent living facilities, and we also have lots of different programs, including social services. We have affordable transportation available for our seniors, job training, companion service, senior escort program, utility assistance, and much more available here. And please visit our website if you are interested in any of those. It's accsv.org. And also, we just wanted to let everyone know that we started these online programs at the beginning of the pandemic and really started ramping up as we saw that more and more were going to be going into this virtual world. And so since then, we've done over 600 different shows, presentations, classes, and concerts. And that has included different things like yoga, Tai Chi, Zumba, and also Chinese zhong making and plant-based eating and concerts that are by some of our own ACC clubs. And so we really welcome you to ACC Senior Services and hope that you can join us for many more presentations. We have a wonderful author here today by the name of Kate Washington, and she is going to be interviewed by Simone Nizal, and she is the Education Coordinator at Del Oro Caregiver Resource Center. But before we get to them, we do want to tell you about our upcoming presentation next Wednesday, and that's February 9th at 1 o'clock. It's going to be The Secrets of the Sacramento Room, and so you'll be joining James Scott at the Sacramento Public Library, and here's a short clip.
Hi there, my name is James Scott. Join me in ACC Senior Services on Wednesday, February 9th at 1 o'clock as we explore the secrets of the Sacramento Room. The Sacramento Room is located in the central branch of the Sacramento Public Library, and it's there where rare photographs, rare books, and public records will open your eyes to the restless history of Sacramento, back to the 1850s and beyond. Through the magic of live streaming, cameras will follow me all throughout the room and even into the vault, where some of the most prized possessions of the Sacramento Public Library are kept, some as old as the 1400s. If you're not yet a friend of the Sacramento Public Library or the Sacramento Room, believe me, after watching Secrets of the Sacramento Room, you certainly will be. So, join me, James Scott, and ACC Senior Services on Wednesday, February 9th at 1 o'clock. We hope to see you there.
Hi, and welcome. My name is Simone Nizal. I'm the Education Coordinator at Del Oro Caregiver Resource Center, one of the 11 CRCs across the state of California. We offer a suite of services to unpaid family caregivers, and Del Oro specifically focuses on caregivers in the Gold Country counties, of which there are 13 in essentially the greater Sacramento region. We're so excited to be able to partner with ACC Senior Services to bring you this interview with a local author, Kate Washington, who I'm joined with today. Kate authored the book Already Toast, of which I have a copy here, my copy, which essentially covers her experiences as a family caregiver, as well as her unique insights and research into caregiving across the nation. So please help me welcome Kate. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. A little bit about you for our audience as they get to know you. You were a former dining critic for the Sacramento Bee, a local editor for Zagat Survey's Guide to Sacramento Restaurants, and your writing has appeared in the New York Times, Time Magazine, Eater, Catapult, and a number of other publications. You also hold a PhD from my alma mater, Stanford, in Victorian literature, which actually appears in Already Toast. And you live in Sacramento with your husband, Brad, and 2 daughters. Before we get started with formal questions, I did want to check in with you and see how your family, how Brad and your girls are doing.
Yeah, I think we're overall doing well. For those who aren't familiar with the book and the story, Brad went through a diagnosis of 2 kinds of cancer and a really challenging stem cell transplant about 6 years ago. He still has ongoing chronic illness from that. But he's much more able to manage his own care than he was at the period about which I wrote the book. Our daughters are quite a bit older. They were pretty young, 9 and 5 when he was diagnosed, and now they're a junior in high school and a middle schooler here in Sacramento. And so, we're muddling through. The pandemic's been a challenge for everybody, and in some ways has brought me back to certain kinds of caregiving duties that had really shifted for me prior to the pandemic. So I'm sure we'll talk much more about that.
Yes, I'm curious to learn more from you, and thank you for that update. I can't believe how the passage of time that you have a junior in high school.
Yes.
So I wanted to start with this question about the sandwich generation of caregivers, and your book has a lot of nice references to bread, toast, sandwiches. So the sandwich generation is a sandwich generation of caregivers is essentially those people who are caring for an older adult, either a spouse or a parent, while also parenting their own children. You would have been considered and still are considered part of this sandwich generation. And I'm curious, how did you feel squeezed by being in both roles? How did you feel and how have you felt being in both roles simultaneously?
Yeah, it's a real challenge. I think, the average age of a family caregiver in the US right now is 49, which happens to be the age I am now, and also I think speaks to the degree to which people are likely to have kids at home, as well as caring for a parent, a loved one, a family friend, an aunt, a grandparent, a spouse. For me, I really wasn't thinking about becoming a caregiver when my husband got sick. He was diagnosed shortly after our younger daughter started kindergarten, and I've been, as your introduction indicated, I've been a writer for a long time, and so I'd been a freelance writer, and when our daughter started kindergarten, I was thinking, oh, I have made it to the point when I can do much more focusing on my own writing and much less focusing on having a tiny little kid at home. And then he was diagnosed, and everything really shifted, and my care responsibilities, which I'd previously thought of mainly in terms of childcare, really shifted over to caring for him through his illness. And at first, that was not necessarily a hands-on care. It was more, one of the things I talk about in the book is that there's a huge range of responsibilities and duties and tasks that encompass caregiving. Caregiving is everything from people who are caring for someone long distance to being in an advisory role. At first for me, I was just going along to medical appointments, learning more about cancer diagnosis, sometimes dealing with insurance paperwork. All of that is caregiving, but I didn't really identify as a caregiver until later. And it sort of snuck up on me, which I think is also really common for a lot of caregivers. It's really common, especially caring for an older adult, maybe through memory care or dementia. You start to notice that something is off, and before you even really realize that you're in the caregiving role, you're kind of in the thick of it. Later on, and we can talk about this too, later on, my husband's needs became much more medical and hands-on, and that's something that's really a hallmark now of family caregiving for a lot of people, is doing hands-on medical care at a pretty high and demanding level, which I'm sure is something that a lot of folks in our audience will have experienced or seen up close.
Thank you for that. As a kind of a follow-up, do you feel like there were ever any moments where parenting and caregiving complemented one another? Or was it mostly the squeeze?
I would say it was a little more the squeeze. I know somebody who refers to it not just as the sandwich generation, but as the panini generation, panini caregiving, because people are squashed flat and things are oozing out the sides. And I think that that's something that the pandemic has really highlighted for a lot of people, and for us, for many folks, the lack of support in caregiving, both childcare and in terms of caring for family members, either elders or others, is really profound. You know, for me, I was doing a lot of emotional support for my kids. They were distressed, of course, by the severity of my husband's illness. When he was hospitalized for his bone marrow transplant, he was in the hospital for 4.5 months and was in an isolation room, and they did not allow children. And he was far too sick to do a FaceTime or any of the virtual things that have become, you know, so common for us now. He just couldn't manage that. So they didn't see him for months. And in some ways, because he was in the hospital and they were at home, there was some separation. And when I was with the girls, I could really focus on them and focus on parenting. But, you know, I think anyone who's watching this who's had a loved one in the hospital will know you can wait all day for the doctors to round and talk to you about what's happening with your loved one. And the time they come by is invariably 5 minutes after you had to leave to go pick up the kids from school, or finally get to the bathroom, or you were desperate to get lunch at, you know, 3:30 in the afternoon. That's when they show up. And those tugs and those challenges of being there for more than one loved one, you can't be everywhere at once, and it's really hard.
Yeah. Thank you for your honesty, and for a new term, which I hope will go viral, the panini generation.
Well, I should say it's not original to me, but
yes, you duly credited your source. I appreciate that. I do want to jump into the book. In the book, you mention that you were in a relatively privileged position as a caregiver, but still found it overwhelming. And I thought that was really interesting, honest, and one of the more compelling parts of the book. What privileges did you feel you enjoyed as a caregiver?
Oh, I mean, there are a lot. We had health insurance, good health insurance. My husband was a professor at Sacramento State. So for anyone in our audience in Sacramento who knows how CalPERS operates, we had the benefit of those state benefits, which are amazing, and which I think everyone should have that kind of privilege, and sadly, many do not. He was able to take leave from work. I was a freelance writer, so I could take an endless amount of leave, though none of it was paid, of course. And I think that's something that we're sorely lacking in this country, and I'm sure we'll get to that, is paid leave to help people with their caregiving duties. You know, we had pretty robust savings, so we had economic privilege to ride out the times when neither of us were working. Because of Brad's leave, he was able to get paid through a lot of his illness. We had family help. Brad's parents were able to come from Canada and be with us for significant periods of time during the really difficult parts of his illness. And just also things like, you know, I was constantly aware in the hospital. Brad was treated at UC Davis Medical Center. You know, I was fortunate to have, you know, even facilitating English to communicate with his medical team, education level to understand a lot of the medical terms and be able to communicate and serve as an advocate. And, those things are not to be taken lightly. They're a really important part of caring for a loved one and aren't always available for many people. We had space in our house when he was brought home needing care to, store all of the giant boxes of syringes and, things needing medications needing refrigeration and things like that, just space and the ability to manage those things. And it was still challenging, but I'm really conscious of that. And, the economic effects of caregiving, one of the things I talk about in the book, are really profound and really devastating, disproportionately for women, especially disproportionately for women of color who often have to leave employment. And, I was fortunate not to have to make some of the really devastating choices that people are out there making every day about caring for their loved ones.
Thank you for that. Again, that was really compelling in your book. And I think it's really important for us to highlight the fact that caregiving isn't this one-size-fits-all experience. There are certainly not one-size-fits-all strategies to support caregivers, which you address later in your book as well. I do want to ask you, though, given that you have had this experience of caregiving, do you feel that there are universal challenges for caregivers, things that you all do have in common that you can commiserate about? Yeah.
I mean, yes, I think there are. And I should say, one of the things I do talk about in the book is the number of caregivers, the prevalence of caregiving. The latest studies show there's 53 million caregivers, unpaid family caregivers in the US, which is a huge number. So there's 53 million stories of caregiving out there. But I think some of the commonalities include just the emotional strain. It's really difficult. Caregiving involves, it can be also very rewarding, but it definitely involves role reversals, challenges, changes to roles with a loved one. In the case of a parent, if you're caring for a parent, there is a huge role reversal when the child is taking over, and that may be uncomfortable for both the parent and the child. For me, it was tough, as a spouse, to see that partnership role really change. These kinds of differences in relationship can really alter your feelings about how the relationship functions, sometimes about the person. It can be confusing and overwhelming. It's also just exhausting. The average number of hours per week that a caregiver spends is I think 24 hours a week. And the average duration of caregiving in the US now is 4.5 years. So that is a draining pursuit, unpaid, hourly, day in, day out, few breaks. It's hard to get respite care. The pandemic made it harder.
Right.
The challenging emotions that can arise around caregiving, I think sometimes, especially for women, are hard to acknowledge and can be a source of shame and guilt. When people don't feel positive about, you want to care for your loved one, but because it can be challenging to find support and to find relief from that, then negative emotions come up. And, if we all know, if we squash down our negative emotions, they'll come out somewhere. So
this is true. You talk about how caregiving, at one point you talk about how caregiving kind of sets you apart from other people. And I thought that was a really interesting observation. How does caregiving make it harder to relate to others who maybe aren't in a caregiving role? How does it separate you from the rest of the world?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it simply in terms of the time commitment of caregiving. It's much harder to connect with your friends, to go out and socialize. if you have infection concerns or are isolating during the pandemic, or because a loved one is especially vulnerable, you can't host people in your home. So there's simply like a time challenge around, how all absorbing caregiving is and how tired most caregivers are. And, I'm sure we have people in our audience today who know that all too well firsthand. But I also think, and I talk about this in the book, it's really tough to understand the intensity of being a primary caregiver until you've been in it. And, there's the compounding effects, as I talked about earlier, of, challenge in the relationship with the loved one you're caring for, the time commitment, worry and being frightened about what's happening with your loved one, or grief, anticipatory or as somebody is failing. And all of those things, make it harder to be in a normal social situation. I remember sometimes, like when I could make time, going to see friends, including dear friends who, are still friends and who I love, and hearing them chat about everyday concerns, I just almost felt like I was on the other side of a glass. Like it didn't feel like something I could enter into at all. And my concerns felt so different that it was really tough to connect with them. So I felt self-isolated. For me as a spousal caregiver, I also felt isolated from my partner. Like I felt lonely. Even though I was seeing him often, the relationship had changed so profoundly. It created a kind of loneliness in my own home. And, there have been studies about the feelings of isolation and loneliness that caregivers have, and the rates of that are really high. And that can, over the long term, have pretty significant mental health effects. Caregivers are depressed and anxious at higher rates than the rest of the population.
Right.
And, I should say, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more later, this is a growing issue. The demographically, I already spoke to, that's 53 million caregivers. Well, the baby boomers are aging. The oldest baby boomers turned 75 last year. And what that means is that we are having, we are going to be expecting a wave of aging and the need for more care from more family members, more friends, and not really enough people in the younger generations to support the very real needs of our elders. And it's a societal problem that is coming at all of us, I think, faster than we know.
I think you highlighted earlier in our conversation that the pandemic has only exacerbated this situation. We're now facing, critical shortages of professional caregivers.
Yes.
So the people who would be available to provide respite to a family caregiver such as yourself, on top of this growing number of individuals who are aging. Let's talk a little bit about the system of care. I want to come back to grief, but you talk about in the book how there are these infrastructural problems within the system of care that you observed firsthand. And this is not to diminish the sacrifice and the hard work of healthcare workers by any means, but you noticed that systemically it seemed that a lot of burden fell on the shoulders of the family caregiver. And I'm curious what, in your experience, because we do know that all experiences are different, but what in your experience did you notice was probably the most difficult for you to navigate? What infrastructural problems were most acute, I guess, for you as a family caregiver?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are so many, and we have issues with care at all levels.
Right.
The pandemic has pointed up the shortages in our childcare system, in our caregiving systems, in all kinds of places, and in the healthcare system. For me as a family caregiver, and this would be different, I'm sure, for everybody, for me, one of the big challenges was the expectation of pretty high level care being delivered at home with very little support. When my husband was coming home from the hospital after 4.5 months after his stem cell transplant, he was visually impaired, could not see, could not walk unassisted, was immune compromised, like severely immune compromised, was on, I think, 35 medications, could not eat a full diet worth of his calories, so he needed intravenous nutrition to be
Wow.
administered at home by pump, and I had to be trained in how to give that. And, when he was discharged, his doctor, who was his primary doctor, oncologist, who was amazing and who saved his life many times over, looked at me and said, he can't be left alone even for a minute when he comes home. And at this point, I had been caring for him for a year. I had kids at home. I was wrung out. And I was like, how is that even possible? I have to sleep. And he's like, oh, usually family steps in and it works out fine. And I think that is really indicative of a kind of out of sight, out of mind assumption from the healthcare system that things will be okay at home, that there is a caregiver there to administer the IV medication, to dress the wound, to give the shots, to do the things that need to be done for often very fragile patients. And there has been a big move over the last 20, 30 years to discharge patients, to have them at home, and people are being discharged sicker and more fragile and more in need of care. And it saves the healthcare system quite a lot of money, but that often comes directly at the expense of families. And there can be a real slippage in like the times of discharge where, I was being trained briefly on how to give kinds of care that I really wasn't comfortable giving, and was terrified the first few times I did. I remember the first time I had to give IV antibiotics through my husband's PICC line in his arm, my hands were shaking, and I was so nervous to do that. What if I introduce infection? What if I leave in an air bubble? What if? And and I ended up getting comfortable with it, and it did work out okay. But I think that the expectations of what kind of support a patient has at home are often out of step with reality, out of step with the reality that people's families are working, often in many cases, to maintain the health insurance that will allow people to get care or to keep the house that the person is going to recover in. There's this huge gap in the expectations and the realities of what families can sustainably deliver with all the goodwill in the world. We all want to care for our loved ones. Caring for the people we love is part of, what we are as humans, how we show our love. But it is expecting people to give, 24, 40 hours a week or round the clock unpaid care is not something that most people can just easily pick up and do.
It sounds like you're highlighting this set of assumptions, really, that's kind of the core of the problem. I can hear in your voice your gratitude to your husband's doctor for saving his life. But I also understand that, you studied literature, as did I, and you didn't feel trained for this when he came home, even with some of the training that you received on the spot during discharge. It's overwhelming. And going back to what we were talking about before about privilege, there's an assumption that you're going to be able to understand and execute with very little training, the highly skilled tasks of caregiving. And not everybody is prepared to do that. Not everybody has the time to do that. There isn't this one size fits all experience of caregiving wherein people can kind of carry forth what's expected of them, what may be expected of them by the system of care. And again, to underscore your point, it's not that family caregivers don't care or don't want to do this. And it's not that our healthcare workers are coming from a bad place. There seems to be some sort of just kind of like miscommunication between these two groups, and they're really kind of critical to one another.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd like to underscore two other important groups in that.
Yes,
There's the
please.
family caregivers, there's the healthcare workers and healthcare system, and what gets lost in the shuffle, or what can be problematic, is it's not just bad for caregivers. It's bad. It can be bad for the patients. It can be dangerous for the patients. Outcomes may not be as good. And I would also really point to, our fragmented systems of care. We have, a healthcare industry that creates an extra level of bureaucracy and drives early discharges for cost control measures. And of course we need to keep healthcare costs modest, but they are out of control. And one of the figures that I cite in my book is that AARP and others did a study to determine the value of the care delivered by family caregivers by looking at like a typical hourly wage, and multiplying that out across the number of hours that family caregivers report doing. And this was done, like 8 years ago now. So it's probably maybe an outdated figure at this point, since those numbers have continued to grow. But at that time, that figure was put at $470 billion a year, which is a staggering figure of value that's just not counted in GDP, not thought of as something that is a value add to the economy, but is critical care delivered to really vulnerable members of society who we want to protect. And I do not have the number crunching chops to do this, but I would be very interested to see, that figure placed along cost savings to insurance companies and health systems around early discharges and delivering more care at home to fragile and very ill patients, as compared to delivering that same care in the hospital by full-time nursing staffs. Because what happened at my house was that we essentially for a while ran a hospital at home, to the detriment of everyone else who lived in the house, really.
Thank you for that. Thank you too for complicating by understanding. And it's one of the things I enjoy about this book is that it's very nuanced and very conscientious about how complex this all is. You mentioned two groups of people that we need to consider. One is the patient, and I just wanted to clarify that second group would be...
I was thinking of the institution. Of health insurance companies, et cetera. But I would also add that we should be thinking too about paid care workers, their training, their vulnerability to difficult job situations. They tend to be terribly underpaid, not as well trained as they should be for a very, delicate and skilled set of tasks. I think paid care workers are often considered almost to be unskilled workers, which is a real, misconception. And paid care workers also are disproportionately women of color, often immigrants, often in very vulnerable and, contingent employment situations. And we really need to shore up those systems of care and make those jobs better paid, better trained, safer for the workers, better working conditions for the workers. as well as, and that will benefit everyone. That will benefit family caregivers, that will benefit patients, and most of all, it will benefit the people doing this truly essential labor.
You know, I laughed to myself when I heard you use the word unskilled. It's laughable to think that our professional caregivers are unskilled. They're, especially when they're providing respite to family caregivers. I wanted to ask you, you know, if you had the chance outside of your immediate family to work with professional caregivers, and what that relationship was like, what your experiences was like.
Yeah, we did hire professional caregivers when my husband came home from the hospital after his stem cell transplant. After we were told that like he can't be left alone even for a moment,
Right.
24-hour-a-day care, because we didn't have family to step in who could pull 8-hour shifts around the clock. You know, I think that's an unreasonable expectation. And we were very fortunate to be able to pull money out of savings to pay for that. We were also very fortunate that my husband's need for that level of care didn't last forever.
Indefinitely.
It was not an
Right.
indefinite situation.
Right.
So he needed that kind of care for, 3-4 months over the period when his needs were the most acute. And we hired local women who had a small family business. They were related to each other. So we paid them directly. They did have a business and an employer identification number. We paid them directly. We had a choice between using them or using an agency, and I chose to work with the smaller family group in the hopes that their actual hourly pay and what we were paying them would go more directly into their pockets, as opposed to through an agency where the hourly rate to us was higher, but I was afraid the hourly rate to the care workers would be lower. And that also gave us consistency with the people we were working with, and they were wonderful.
Yeah.
They were in our home 24 hours a day for a long time. It was, it's an intimate relationship. It's one that, requires a certain amount of respect, and they were very kind. They were lovely to Brad. Our family got to know them, and, I wanted to be able to pay them more. We paid them the hourly rate that they asked for, and it was expensive.
Yeah.
And it's not at all covered by insurance, even though that was medically ordered that he needed that round-the-clock care.
Right.
There is a gap between this sort of like, oh, the doctor says you need 24-hour care. The insurance is not paying for that, except in very special circumstances. And, I don't think we need to get into the nitty-gritty of that now, but there are some cases. But this is a huge challenge for families who need that kind of respite and attendant care. People who, you think of it especially with like older adults who need memory care, who, might be happier and thrive better in their familiar home environment, but can't really be left unattended. And the cost of round-the-clock care over a long period of time through a dementia journey is simply untenable for families to bear that cost. So this, that kind of attendant care is so important to so many people and is really unsupported.
Yeah. I'm glad that you highlighted that. It's actually one of the services that Del Oro Caregiver Resource Center provides. The CRC system, our sister agencies across the CRC system also provide respite in the form of either professional caregivers coming into the home and giving the caregiver a break, or providing the care receiver an outlet at an adult day program, again, in the spirit of giving the caregiver a break. But what I keep hearing you kind of say which I think is important for our audience to really to take in, is that family caregivers can't do this alone. There are a lot of services and people that need to sort of be part of this village of caregiving. And right now, as things are, we have some things in place, but there can be more that we do in the future. Mm-hmm. At the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned the Family Medical Leave Act, and I know that that's been discussed in legislation. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about what you believe, average Americans should be entitled to when it comes to that leave.
Right. So just to clarify
Yes.
where we are, the current law of the land federally is the Family Medical Leave Act, which I believe was passed in 1993. So we're coming up on 30 years. And that provides 12 weeks of unpaid leave. So it's essentially a job guarantee. It's not available to all workers because there are limitations on the size of businesses that have to offer that. In California, we do have some paid leave. I believe it's 8 weeks partial paid leave. So we're one of only 8 or 9, I think 9 now, states that have paid leave available to workers who are caregivers, taking care of folks, sick leave, that kind of thing. So that's rare among the states. And in the Build Back Better package, originally there was a proposal for 12 weeks of paid leave, which was whittled down to 4 weeks, which then was pulled out of the legislation entirely. And then 4 weeks went back in, and now the legislation is stalled. Okay. So this would provide a huge benefit to people, even though it's only 4 weeks.
And it's 4 weeks paid leave.
Paid leave. Yes. And I'm not entirely sure how the it is a funded program, but I don't know the percentage of pay. But at any rate, this would make some form of paid leave the law of the land nationally. And you could just imagine what a benefit this would be to people who are caring for somebody and who would have to take an unpaid day off to take their loved one to the doctor, et cetera. This is a really important step. And we're one of, I think, 3, something like that, countries that doesn't have this.
One of 3 developed
countries. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's all our peer countries offer paid leave to people. And it's critical for new parents. It's critical for those taking care of elders or spouses or their kids. So that is like the baseline policy that I kind of think about as important. There's so much that could be done, to support caregivers in policy and also by employers. Like employers could be offering paid leave, offering caregiver supports of different kinds. Some employers have started to do this. It's a really important measure for diversity, equity, and inclusion because caregivers are disproportionately women and more so women of color. So supporting those employees that businesses have invested into, this is a way to retain that valuable talent. That said, the more the better off the employee, the more likely they are to have access to paid leave. People who have hourly positions often, typically do not have it.
Thank you for that.
There's a lot, but there are a lot of other things, in different countries. There are all kinds of caregiver support. That's kind of the last chapter of my book is about that, about, what kind of policy things we could make change in to make caregiving more sustainable for the future.
Call to action.
Yeah,
I appreciate that. And I appreciate you've sort of answered one of my questions about, what legislators can do. And I think that this is an important thing for us to be considering now and advocating for. We have a couple of questions from the audience that I want to get to in a moment. Before we do, though, I'd like to circle back to the exploration of grief in your book. And I love that you are so interested in words and the roots of words. And you talk about grief being at the root of caregiving. I wanted to focus on that for a moment. How do you see grief being at the root of caregiving?
Well, so what you're referring to about the words is the word care. Mm-hmm. When I started researching this book and looking at the word caregiving, one of its root words, care, I assumed would be like from a Latin root, but it was actually from like a Germanic root meaning like wailing and lamentation. Mm-hmm. And so it sort of like had, grief and sorrow as a form of care, like baked into the root of the word, which I thought was interesting and surprising. And actually another thing that I learned since writing the book, the compound caregiving is actually pretty recent. It doesn't really appear in the language until like the 70s. But thinking about caregiving in terms of grief, I think that can kind of cut two ways. Like you're caring for somebody. People often have the grief of having a changed relationship. I spoke to that earlier. The alteration, the worry, the distress around somebody's illness, around the crisis that you've been through. There can be a lot of trauma and shock for both the ill person and potentially the caregiver as well. And then also caregiving very often, and for me, my husband survived. He is chronically ill. He's doing much better than he was at the time I wrote about. But I'm very conscious that for many, if not maybe most people, that is not how a caregiving journey ends. Caregiving very, very often ends in the grief of loss. And I think because it is often complicated getting to that point, people have already been under severe strain. The loved one may pass away, and there can be feelings, like a huge, complicated array of feelings, including sometimes relief that somebody's suffering is at an end, and that can be hard to deal with. Sometimes can prompt guilt. There's a lot to contend with in the grief phase and in the aftermath of caregiving. And one of the things I tried to talk about in the book, because I don't often see this addressed, is that caregiving doesn't like wrap up neatly with a bow at the end of it. Either, as in my case, we have quite a different relationship because my husband was pretty permanently altered by his illness, or much more sadly, people lose the loved one they've been caring for, and often like all the feelings that they did not have time to address during the time of caregiving come roaring back at that point. And it's a really sensitive time and a really difficult time, and something that I think people that needs more recognition around the after phase of caregiving.
Thank you. Just a lot to take in there. I have one more question for you before we hear from the audience, and this has to do with self-care. In the book, you indicate that self-care for caregivers, the idea of it can be difficult, and it's more complicated than one might think. Especially because of historical barriers and inequities, the way in which caregiving is gendered. I'm curious how you think we can broaden our understanding of self-care, because I know for a fact that telling a caregiver, well, just go get a massage or go get a mani-pedi, doesn't land the same way for each person and doesn't equal self-care for each person. So again, how can we broaden our understanding of what self-care should look like?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's a tough one because I think as you allude to, for a lot of caregivers doing those typical self-care things, first of all, they may not have the time or the money, and second of all, it may prompt a lot of guilt if they can carve out respite care, and it just slips to the bottom of the to-do list. You know, your list is always so long, and that type of self-care is often kind of a band-aid, I think, on a much bigger systemic problem. So I'm very wary. I do think we all need to do what we can to take care of ourselves, whether that's, seeking out mental health support, hopefully through therapy if that's accessible, or, making sure to get as much sleep as possible, trying to carve out time for exercise or whatever feeds your spirit through the challenge of caregiving, so that you feel like are doing as well as you can be under difficult circumstances. But I think the bottom line is that what we really need is not self-care, but community care. Because for all of us, caregiving is something that's going to come for most of us. We will need to be cared for, or we will need to care for somebody else. And if we prepare for that and think ahead to the idea that care is a human responsibility and a human right, and we care for our communities and for each other, we can take our turn. Oh, sorry. Sunshine. We can take our turn in being cared for as needed. And I think, we've really seen some of the limitations of self-care during the pandemic in the sense that like everybody is kind of like at their wit's end and like having a hard time caring for each other, caring for themselves, and does not have the resources or the reserves to care for each other. Like when everybody is stressed, and people can't come together for, a lot of good logistical and, infection related reasons, that has really challenged all our systems of care, but it highlights even more the need to have that and to care for each other and to develop strong community ties where, people brought me so many meals while my husband was sick. That was an invaluable support. It was so important. And so now, I'm trying to pay it forward where I can and bring those meals to the friends and family when they are in need. So
Right. Community care, not self-care.
Community care and self-care.
Community care and self-care.
Yes.
I appreciate that too, that you highlighted how the pandemic has complicated ideas of self-care and made outlets for self-care no longer accessible. So, and as you were talking, I was thinking about Rosalind Carter's quote, where she highlights how, over the course of the lifespan, you are going to be in all of these different roles. You're going to be someone who requires care. You're going to be someone who gives care. You're going to be someone who knows someone who's giving care. And how that should, kind of be at the forefront of our sense of who we are as human beings.
Yeah.
With that, I want to take a look at some of the questions that came from our audience members and open them up. We have a couple of minutes. So let's see. Our first question, what are action steps that caregivers can take to avert burnout, if any? Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I alluded to it a little bit in talking about community care and self-care, reaching out and asking for help proactively early on, getting training, asking for as many resources as you can find, access the resources offered by Del Oro, for instance, or other community organizations. You do have to be kind of proactive about this. People often do not know about the community resources that are out there. But I think, we have this very individualist culture that teaches us to kind of go it alone and rely on ourselves and like, you know, have your own nuclear family doing things. But we really do need to access our communities to make sure we're avoiding that burnout and getting all the resources that are available. You know, sometimes it can feel like there aren't enough, but there are things out there to help. And, you know, asking also, I think, for the help you really need is critical. There are actually a lot of apps now that are in this space where, you know, you can put your needs on an app, and a friend or community member can like jump in and say like, yes, I can mow your lawn, or I can, you know, pick you up laundry detergent when I'm at Target, so that you can, it's a little more comfortable, I think, for some people than, you know, it's tough to reach out to a friend and be like, can you go get milk? I just ran out, you know, to make that specific ask. But, you know, the true friends and the people who want to provide that help, I think, want to know how to be truly helpful instead of offering things that may not, you know, may not be what the person is really needing for support.
I'm glad that you highlighted those care coordination apps, because they have really made it easier to communicate, especially in this age of, you know, quarantining and isolating, and as technology expands. I wanted to add to your recommendations support groups as well. I think a lot of people assume or have assumptions about support groups and are wary of them initially. However, they can be a great place to build community, to get support, to know that you're not alone.
Yeah, I would add to that also, thank you for bringing that up, because I think that is really important. And the thing is, another like really good thing to think about with support groups is that now there's a lot of forums and online resources. You can connect to people through Facebook groups or through different kinds of online groups, so that the time problem of support groups is not such an issue. You know, one of the words of the pandemic was asynchronous, you know, and like, I think a thing that's tough for caregivers in accessing support is often, you know, if there is a support group and you live in South Sacramento and the support group is at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday in Roseville, you cannot go and do that support group. But if the support is through forums online, you can type in your issue or connect with people at any time when you have an odd moment, and that is a real benefit.
Yeah. You leveraged online communities, as I understand it from your book, and Twitter as well, social media.
Yeah, I did meet like people, because Brad's illness was so rare, I ended up meeting people to connect with who were caring for people in similar situations, like kind of around the world, actually.
That's really cool. Yeah. We had another question from the audience that I did want to just highlight briefly about legislation in California to address gaps in resources for caregivers. California is lucky to have a master plan on aging that was signed into law by Governor Newsom at the beginning of last year. Do you want to share any thoughts or insights about the master plan on aging, or any other legislation that you may have encountered during your research that might help to address some of these needs?
Yeah, I mean, different states are doing different things. Washington State has an innovative program, though I understand it's having some budgetary challenges. But I'm glad you mentioned the master plan on aging, because it has, I think, 5 planks, and it's really focused on a wide range of issues that will be facing seniors in the years to come, and is a really proactive approach. And one of those 5 planks, the 4th one, is like creating caregiving that works. And they're looking at it across, from what I understand, they're looking at it across the board. Like in local communities, they worked with different municipalities or counties that are doing innovative things to look at like how to create better training for caregivers, all of those issues we spoke to earlier, of using paid caregiving to complement the work of family caregivers. But it is just really refreshing to see an approach that is taking caregiving into account as a really important part of making aging work for our aging population.
And sustainable.
Yeah.
And as I understand it too, there's an emphasis in this pillar in the Master Plan on Aging to train and recruit and retain professional caregivers who would provide, assistance, respite for family caregivers. So,
Yes.
Yes.
California is also, and I think this is really important, changing the income limits on using Medicaid.
Okay.
So previously for Medicaid benefits, people would have to spend down all of their assets. And those are rising this year, I think as of June, so that far more people will be able to access Medicaid before they are honestly completely impoverished, which was the previous standard. And that's going to increase access to better care for people. And that's a benefit to patients and caregivers alike.
Oh. Kate, it's been so wonderful talking to you today. And I hope that everybody on the call today has a chance to pick up Already Toast. It's available at most major book retailers, including Amazon.com. I'm so happy to have had the opportunity to collaborate with ACC to bring, all of your knowledge and wisdom to our community. Please take a look at Already Toast, Caregiving and Burnout in America by Kate Washington. Make this your next read. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.